We're here at MIT visiting Dean Eckles, who is a professor at the business school here. Very excited to have a chat about his experience doing experiments, doing research, and collaborating with companies as well. One thing I'm curious about, obviously, your work, I think, is initially inspired by being at Meta back when it was Facebook and running experiments there where network structure plays an important role. I've started to realize that either network structure or marketplace effects, basically every company almost has to deal with this in some capacity. And I think this kind of isn't as obvious maybe in most cases, right? People start with just running an experiment, just a simple randomization, and then maybe only a year or a couple of years down the line, they realize, oh, there are these extra factors at play, whether that's a social network, a graph structure that affects outcomes, or a marketplace, and kind of cause SUTVA violations, right, in a technical sense. I was curious whether what your take is on how should companies start thinking about this problem if they go from kind of more simple, naive randomization to starting to think about how the structure affects their experimentation problems and outcomes.
Yeah. And I think, you've dealt with this some previously in the context of issues of like inventory, right, and these kinds of issues as well. So even like a single retailer essentially can face issues where if they're changing the recommendation system for some users, that's causing them to stock out or not of particular items, and then that's affecting other users who are in other treatments. And so I think it actually can be a lot more common than people anticipate, especially when there are big effects. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I'd say is one of the main guidelines I have here is that, I don't think this is a hard and fast law. There aren't a lot of kind of laws in what is the social sciences, right? But I think it's relatively rare that some experiment that you'd run kind of as a simple user level randomized A/B test and you're not doing much. Like you just can tell you're not pulling levers very far. There are pretty much precise null effects. I would usually not be super worried about interference there. It's not necessarily true, but where I think it ends up mattering a lot is these cases where, oh, hey, we are changing things really substantially, right? We're really changing prices. We're really changing the recommendation system in a big way. We're adding a completely new feature for some users rather than others, right? Those are the cases where you really want to think about, hey, what happens if some people have this feature and their friends don't have it? What happens if some people are suddenly really getting promoted this item that we don't have that much of? I guess that's like one of the basic intuitions that I would have. And I think sometimes, this is not really an answer to your question, but sometimes in the reverse direction, one of the problems that can occur is that people turn to imagined network effects or imagined spillover processes as a way to kind of salvage their ideas that don't work, right? So back when I was at Facebook and we had built some tools for running experiments designed to account for network effects, one of the kind of modes of interaction that we'd end up with in managers was some PM saying, hey, we ran a standard user level A/B test and the results were null, or the results were positive but small. We think this is like really underestimating the true magnificent benefits of our product. And so we want to run this like network clustered experiment to show what these true aggregate effects are. And I think a lot of times that was sort of misguided, actually, that they were kind of really reaching, really wanting to believe that there were these network effects there. Now, that's not to say that actually, you can have all these circumstances where they could dramatically attenuate or overstate effects. You could even get effect reversal from these kinds of interference processes. So that's not to minimize them at all. And obviously I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, but I think it's good to like prioritize where does that fit in and see also how that set of tools and ways of thinking then becomes part of organizational and kind of managerial complexity of it all. I think one of the areas where this is maybe coming up more is just people are doing more geographically randomized experiments, again, for reasons related to kind of privacy regulation and technological change in the context of digital marketing. And so I think people are getting increasingly comfortable with doing, or they're going to have to, with doing various sorts of clustered experiments, whether it's by geography or by some of the kinds of clusters that Google is going to surface, et cetera. And so once you start doing these cluster randomized experiments, then it's not that you're not that far away from sort of thinking about how to structure those clusters to account for spillovers between people who are at least in the same cluster.
Right. Excellent. Changing gears a little bit, one thing, you wrote a blog post recently talking about a study that you were trying to do, but early on you realized that kind of the conditions didn't quite work out, and ended up abandoning this study. And it made me realize, like, we have heard about this kind of publication bias, right? That only wins get published, and that has issues. But this blog also illustrated to me that there's a lot of learnings maybe that go unnoticed because things don't work out, and then people don't write about it. And so I was curious, first of all, if you could walk us through a little bit of that study, and then also taking a step back, like what are some of the learnings that you've had over the years that you might not have been able to publish necessarily, right? Because they had more to do with things that didn't work out than did work out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in that study, we were working with a fitness tracker app, and we were interested in basically the effects of goal setting. So if you get people to set goals, maybe this could help them weather some disruptions in their life. We were actually particularly interested in daylight savings time. As somebody who usually runs in the afternoon, daylight savings time is often a disaster for my running routine. So it was a little bit of me search kind of thing. But anyway, the idea was, okay, we're going to send push notifications to a random set of people, and they're then going to be encouraged to form goals, and we'll see if that helps them kind of weather this disruption, especially maybe people who we think are going to be most disrupted by this. What happened was that, there was a statistically significant effect of the notifications on goal formation, actually highly stat sig. But it was just not enough people. I think in the experiment, there was like maybe hundreds of thousands of people in the experiment. I'm trying to remember exactly. But, we got, I think, if you sort of calculate, it is like, 500 people or something like that formed goals because of the experiment. I'm not sure if that number is totally correct. But, some small number of people. It was just hopeless then if your goal is to not look at the effect of the notifications, but to say, hey, look, these notifications aren't going to affect anything except for the people who we induced to set goals by sending them the notifications. And that is now this tiny kind of sample size, right? So it's just sort of hopeless to use this instrument, and that's what we would think of it as an instrumental variable in the context of causal inference. But, this method, this way of sending people these push notifications to get them to set goals, that's not going to be a strong enough way to look at what the effect of goal setting is. We need to hit some people with something more than just this one push notification if we want to learn about the effects of goal setting. So we basically just gave up that project, right? We didn't even try to look at the outcome data, right? Where the outcomes were really about exercise, not goal setting, in the subsequent weeks. And so I think that's actually, it's interestingly a little bit different than what people usually think of as sort of pernicious cases of publication bias, where that would be like where we actually had looked at the outcomes and then we said, well, the outcomes are null. There's no effect on exercise, so we're dropping this. No, instead, we basically said somehow our kind of effective sample size here is a lot smaller than we thought. This is just not worth pursuing. Now, one thing we did learn from this that was substantive was, hey, these push notifications, they kind of work, but maybe at least in this relatively untargeted way, they aren't getting people to create goals. And that could have, for this firm, been an opportunity to say, hey, we need to refine the goal creation workflow. We could think about other points in the app to prompt people to create goals, this kind of thing. But it wasn't really going to tell us about what our main interest was, hey, does setting goals work to help people manage disruptions, which would be very, useful for this company as well to figure out, hey, when should, if we do figure out a way to help people set goals, when should we be doing that? So I think it's interesting because it's just a little bit different than like this usual case of kind of publication bias. And I see it as less pernicious in a lot of ways than those other cases. So I'll give you another example, though, of how this happens just in a corporate setting, because people often think of just because it's called publication bias, they think of it really as about being, something that happens in academic literature, not in companies. But of course, it happens in companies too, because people only bother to send around experimental results. People only add experimental results to their PowerPoints when things work out, right? And so I think this is one of the points where actually good tooling is really helpful, because it helps you keep track of all the experiments that have been conducted and stay realistic about that, as opposed to sort of these different silos of people analyzing their experiments, and then information about experiments from one silo only makes it to the other when the experiments are successful, right? So that happens in companies. So actually a long time ago when I was working at Facebook, I was talking with a PM, and we had this really brilliant idea, which was that, not at the time, not a lot of people were using the functionality on Facebook to reshare things. If you see something in your feed, you can click share and propagate it. And we thought, internally we call this reshare, but the button says share. Maybe we should try changing the button text to say reshare. So this is a really brilliant idea. So we're getting ready to do this, and actually we had some other plans to change some other features of this interface. And so there was actually a factorial design that this was one factor of. As we were setting up to do this, somebody said, hey, I think actually somebody ran an experiment on that like 6 months ago, but it didn't really work out. You should, talk to so-and-so. And so I did. And yeah, they had run this experiment with basically null results. And so, that was this case where it's just like, there was this kind of diffuse institutional knowledge there about what had been tried and what hadn't been tried. Now, it actually, in that example, it turned out that then when I talked to that person, they're like, one thing you might consider is whether there was translation issues here, because reshare, it's not like really a word. So we kind of wonder how this got translated by our whole like automated, crowdsourced translation system into all these different languages. So perhaps we should kind of check on that. So then I actually reanalyzed the old experiment, split out by language, and found that actually for English speakers, it increased rates of resharing, essentially because the people who were most using that button at the time were, I think, like Turks and Italians, and it didn't work so well for them. And I'm not sure what the translation was there, but you might also think, hey, they just already knew what the button meant, and we somehow changed the button all of a sudden on them, that it was, hurting their usage of this feature while other people's usage was increasing, especially English speakers. So actually that null result that had sort of almost been forgotten was masking a bunch of heterogeneity there. So then we said, okay, let's run the new experiment, and we'll actually just initially run it in English. And then if this is promising, we'll figure out what should we do in the case of all these other languages. So we reran the experiment in just American English, actually, and got completely null results that were completely statistically incompatible with the results from 6 months prior. So that was kind of an interesting experience to me. So I actually use this example in my teaching a bit and like try to get students to think about, hey, what changed? Like, why did this effect go away? I don't know. What do you think? Why did we get null results the second time?
One thing I've learned is trying to make up stories, in hindsight is maybe easier, but I know when I do it ahead of time, I'm usually wrong. And so maybe I should also not do it in hindsight. I feel like there's, there could be a lot that's going on. And often there's like these secondary effects that turn out to be first order effects. I feel like I think that often when there are results that at least in my experience, where it's like, oh, we thought this would happen and it didn't, there's like some other factor that's at play that no one thought of. So in this case, although that's also telling ourselves a story, right? So who knows whether that's right. Do you have a hypothesis?
I mean, nothing's definitive. I mean, one thing is just, with the passage of time, more people learned what the button did.
Right. Yep.
So basically, then you're changing a button that more people now know what it does already. So then you'd kind of expect that that's confusing for the people who already know what the old button did, and helpful for a smaller fraction of people. And that maybe that you also have a bunch of, the population of people on the service is changing over time. And so there's some kind of shift happening there, and different people had different levels of comfort with it, right? You might think, hey, if you were on that time and you were also on Twitter and Twitter had the retweet functionality, then maybe the in reshare actually helps you understand what it is. Yep. If like normal people, you're not on Twitter, then you know, the maybe doesn't help you at all. Right. So
yeah, fantastic. Yeah, you have the repost on LinkedIn, the retweet. So maybe there's something there now.
Yeah. Though I think this was I don't know when LinkedIn rolled out some of this, because this is in 2010 and 2011, by the way, just like what we're talking about.
No. So
ancient. It's clear that this is ancient history.
Yeah. Very, very cool story, though. And one thing, shifting gears a little bit, is that you've worked with a wide variety of companies, like famously Meta, but also a whole bunch of others, right? A fitness tracker app. And one thing I'm curious about, you must have observed how all of these different companies think about experimentation a little bit differently, might have a different culture. I was curious whether you have any observations of what parts of culture really help in building this culture, or you've seen work really well, or things that make it a little bit more challenging to run experimentation or kind of build that culture.
Yeah, I think that's something I wish we had actually more quantitative research about, because you get these sort of particular impressions. And a lot of times when I've worked with companies, either in like a consulting role or through some research collaboration, you're interacting with kind of one part of the company. Mm-hmm. And then your impressions are determined a lot by that, as opposed to, you know, some really synoptic or systematic view of what they're doing. So anyway, I think that's like a great thing to learn about more. One impression that I have is just that making it easier to run experiments is a huge lever for increasing experimentation, right? It's actually one of my old mentors, BJ Fogg, really likes to emphasize the idea that what you need to get in action is motivation, ability, and some kind of trigger to do it. And if you can just increase people's ability to do these things, all of a sudden you don't need a lot of time from an engineer. A lot of times there's latent motivation there, actually. And then that's kind of the easiest case in some sense, because actually everybody's bought in from a motivational perspective. It's just a matter of saying, hey, we're making it easy, and we're kind of reminding you at the right point in some process that, hey, you should be running an experiment, triggering you to actually run the experiment. So I think that's a big part of it. Of course, a lot of times there's other motivational issues of reasons that people are resistant to experimentation, et cetera. I think that's a big part of it. And then another factor is just, it's like way easier to do it in some settings than others. And so I think that becomes something that we shouldn't neglect, that there are reasons why it can be a lot harder to have just a practice of testing everything when you're a B2B business with a smaller number of customers. And, you know, there's just really only so many experiments you could be running concurrently that are going to be independent of each other on the sample sizes you're working with, these types of things. That's one aspect of it. You know, one variation that I've seen in different companies is just what the process for kind of how centralized review of experiments is. Right? Is it like, oh, the experimentation team builds tools and then everybody just kind of runs their own experiments and decides to launch or not launch at the level of, you know, some product team, and maybe even it's just kind of engineers are doing this? Or is it that there's actually like a real systematic review process by an entirely central team or one for a whole product org? I don't know that there's an exact right answer of what that is, but I've been struck with how that's different in some different companies. And it makes me think about also what's some of the tooling that you can introduce to make what could be a heavyweight process of experimentation review easier.
Right. Yes. No, I resonate. On one hand, I think the centralized review is good, but on the other hand, you also want as many people just to maybe experiment, or some companies really, right? Like there's some famous examples of very small changes, simple changes, a one-line code change that made the biggest impact on the largest win in a company history. I think multiple companies have stories like that, right? And so, you know, and so then maybe a centralized heavyweight process makes these changes that someone just thinks of in the fly like not happen. So I think that's a very interesting kind of, I can see both sides of that argument. As you're teaching a class here on analytics, I was kind of curious, what are questions you often get asked by students? What are they interested in and are excited about?
I think one of the questions that I've already touched on a little bit is that a lot of students are coming from working in more of a B2B environment, or environments that are like a little bit farther from the areas where experimentation has most taken off, right? Like who's running the most experiments? Consumer internet companies, right? At least that's my kind of impression, right? I don't know that there's any systematic view onto this. So then if you're coming from a world where, hey, we have these high touch relationships with clients, we don't have a huge number of clients, the clients seem hard to compare with each other, what can we apply from experimentation? So that's one question I get, and I don't have definitive answer to that, but one thing I like to say is, at least in those settings, a lot of times the treatments that you're trying, the new things you're trying, have much bigger effects, actually, right? That because you're willing to sort of actually do things like spend more money, like say, hey, what if we allocated a entire additional sales engineer, forward deployed engineer to a client? What does that do? Well, that's like, oh, whoa, that's a super expensive treatment, right? But that's going to do something, right? It may turn out to not have a positive ROI, but it's going to do something. It's not like you're changing the color of some button, right?
Yep.
Or similarly, like in B2B settings, you can consider changing price structures and the menu of options in ways that it's often not possible to do in B2C. So I think, so that's one line of questioning I get. And I'm not sure there's a definitive answer, but that's definitely, I think we'll be seeing over, coming years, like, okay, how much does this practice of experimentation spread to these other areas that are maybe not nearly as easy as consumer internet?
Yeah, no, I think it's no surprise that kind of experimentation platforms started at Google and Microsoft and Facebook, maybe, right? In some sense, they had the usage, the infrastructure to make it easy. And like you said, like making experimentation easy is a great driver to run more experiments, right? So there's like clearly a virtuous cycle there. And it's harder for when you don't have that. I'm curious what your sense of that is then. Like, is experimentation really most beneficial too for these companies that can operate at a large scale, large to consumer kind of tech companies? Or do you think that, and are there really like do they reap the rewards that maybe others might not be able to reap as easily? Or do you really think that, even if it's more challenging, that shouldn't stop people from running experiments, because in the end, even if it's more challenging, it's worth it and kind of needed to make progress.
Yeah,
and
well,
build a better product.
I think one thing is that when you start trying to optimize or improve something, there's often a lot of low-hanging fruit and then diminishing returns. And so I think a lot of times it can make sense to pursue some of those smaller improvements if you're operating at kind of a big scale and you've made it actually really easy to pursue all of those smaller returns to further innovations. And so that's, I think, some of how these big tech companies are getting, continued benefit from experimentation is like, okay, yeah, we did a pretty good job of improving this thing, and now we're just going to keep improving it some more and keep adaptively changing it as the environment changes, et cetera, right? As our customer base changes. But actually, a lot of the benefits you might be able to get with a much smaller number of experiments. So I think that's some of the opportunity in these cases where you aren't planning on saying, hey, we're going to be like Meta and run, have 20,000 concurrent experiments at any given time, which I think is what Eitan Bakshi said at Code a couple of years ago, right? Like, okay, maybe we're only going to be doing, dozens of experiments a year, but these could be on really important questions that are the kind of questions that would bubble up to the C-suite, that are really costly decisions to get right or wrong.
Yeah, so it's really about realizing like how hard do you want to squeeze the lemon, right? And some companies really benefit a lot from squeezing every last drop. And if you maybe don't have the sample size or other issues, B2B companies come to mind, like maybe it's not, you don't worry so much about squeezing the lemon and trying kind of larger other directions, which may or may not be experiments, of course.
Yeah, and I think on that point, I mean, you mentioned this idea of, there's this, sometimes there's these one-line code changes, these sort of, just little ideas that somebody has, right? Like, I mean, I described the reshare thing as this genius idea, but like, I don't know, it could have worked out that it was like a big deal. I don't know, right? Like these little changes can work out. I think that's one of the really interesting questions in this area is what does the distribution of the quality of ideas look like at different phases in this optimization process? Because the way that you and I have both just described it is just this kind of diminishing returns and you're chasing smaller and smaller things. But I think we also have this, it's in tension with this other idea that we also both have, which is that sometimes there are these other things lurking out there that are in fact big improvements that have been available all along and somehow no one grabbed them before. And so I'm not totally sure what to make of that. I think some of the evidence we have about the distribution of effects is that they are kind of heavy-tailed, right? So that there are some ideas that are like have much bigger effects than the vast majority of other ideas, even after you've been optimizing a product a while. But I think still on average, overall, the ideas are kind of getting less impactful as you're spending more time working on something.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think for some, that's almost an argument against experimentation. Like if you experiment, you focus on kind of the small treatment effects or the things that naturally might not, and you miss details. But I think there's plenty of evidence also. Some folks at Microsoft have this famous paper showing that their treatment effects are heavy-tailed and that like has impacts on how you do analysis, etc. Wrapping up here, I was curious whether you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share or things that have come up that you think would be valuable.
Well, I mean, one thing that I'm just kind of interested in is actually some of these organizational questions as well and the effects of adoption of experimentation tools, right? So we like to really use the highest standards of evidence possible for making these product decisions by doing randomized experiments. And then what's our standard of evidence about how experimentation as a practice is affecting the quality of decisions? Lower, right? Right. We don't have a bunch of A/B tests of A/B testing. I'm not saying that we necessarily need that, but I'd be really fascinated to know more about what it looks like for some of the, let's say the tooling that you all work on at EPO to spread through an organization. How are people changing their decision making? My hope is that as we have more and more companies adopting these technologies, we get more systematic study of that. Now, I actually know of a couple academic studies of this on this topic, but I think there's still so much that we don't know about what happens when you start introducing this tooling and different sorts of tooling into organizations.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic problem. One where I think it's kind of like the B2B problem, right? Like sample size is rough. The companies are so different; they're probably hard to compare. And there's probably a lot of other confounders also that impact whether companies adopt experimentation. So, we probably need some heavy duty causal inference to figure that out.
Yep.
With that, I thought that was fantastic. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And really enjoyed that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Great talking to you.